Welcome, everyone. Today, we are going to discuss a critical topic for every internal medicine resident: the non-infectious causes of hospital-acquired fever. We will walk through a systematic approach to identifying and managing these often overlooked etiologies. Before we begin, please note that this presentation is for medical education purposes only. It does not constitute medical advice, and it is not intended for direct patient care or clinical decision-making. Always consult current clinical guidelines and your attending physicians. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to recognize the clinical importance and prevalence of non-infectious fevers. You will learn how to apply the classic 5 Ws framework while understanding its limitations. We will identify key clinical clues for drug fever and DRESS syndrome. You will learn to recognize and differentiate life-threatening transfusion reactions and hyperthermic emergencies. And finally, we will discuss how to utilize biomarkers like procalcitonin appropriately to guide your management. Let us start with a case. You are called to see a 68-year-old male on postoperative day 8 following a right hemicolectomy. His temperature is 39.2 degrees Celsius, or 102.6 degrees Fahrenheit. His heart rate is 88, blood pressure is 110/70. His white blood cell count is 11.2 with 8% eosinophils. Blood and urine cultures from 48 hours ago are negative. His surgical incision is healing well, but you notice a mild, diffuse maculopapular rash on his trunk. What is the most likely cause of this patient's fever, and what is your next step? Keep this patient in mind as we move through the lecture. Why does this matter? Because not all fevers are infectious. In fact, non-infectious etiologies may account for 25% to over 50% of hospital-acquired fevers, depending on the patient population studied. Failure to recognize these causes leads to significant patient harm. It results in unnecessary antibiotics, which drives Clostridioides difficile infections and antimicrobial resistance. It leads to unnecessary cultures, imaging, and prolonged hospital stays. Most importantly, anchoring on infection can cause you to miss life-threatening diagnoses like pulmonary embolism, neuroleptic malignant syndrome, or adrenal crisis. You are likely familiar with the classic 5 Ws of postoperative fever. Wind for atelectasis or aspiration on days 1 to 2. Water for urinary tract infections on days 3 to 5. Wound for surgical site infections on days 5 to 7. Walking for deep vein thrombosis or pulmonary embolism after day 5. And wonder drugs for drug fever or transfusion reactions at any time. Some also add a 6th W for wonky new tubes, reminding us to check central lines and catheters. However, I want to emphasize a critical clinical note. Atelectasis alone rarely causes a true fever. If a patient has a fever on postoperative day 1, you must consider aspiration or early pneumonia instead. Remember, this mnemonic is just a teaching framework. Non-infectious causes can occur on any day. Let us discuss drug fever. This is strictly a diagnosis of exclusion. You must rule out infection first. Drug fever is estimated to account for 3 to 7% of all febrile episodes in hospitalized patients, although the exact incidence remains uncertain due to underreporting. The onset is typically 7 to 10 days after starting a new medication. Common offending agents include antibiotics like beta-lactams, sulfonamides, and vancomycin, antiepileptics such as phenytoin and carbamazepine, cardiovascular drugs like procainamide and heparin, and other medications like allopurinol. A useful diagnostic clue is that rechallenge with the offending drug typically causes a rapid return of fever, often within hours. How do we recognize drug fever at the bedside? A classic teaching pearl is the inappropriately well-appearing patient who looks remarkably good despite a high fever. Look for relative bradycardia, though it is present in only a minority of cases. You may see eosinophilia in approximately 20 to 30% of cases, so its absence does not rule out the diagnosis. A rash is present in roughly 18 to 25% of cases. If you stop the offending drug, the fever usually resolves within 48 to 72 hours. However, resolution takes longer if a rash is present. We must distinguish simple drug fever from DRESS syndrome, which stands for drug reaction with eosinophilia and systemic symptoms. This is a severe multi-organ hypersensitivity reaction with a mortality rate of approximately 5 to 10%, though some series report rates up to 20%. Onset is typically delayed, occurring 2 to 8 weeks after starting the drug. Key features include high fever, a diffuse rash, profound eosinophilia, and internal organ involvement, most commonly hepatitis. Human herpes virus 6 reactivation is also very common. The top culprit drugs to watch out for include allopurinol, vancomycin, lamotrigine, carbamazepine, and trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole. Diagnosis should be assessed using the RegiSCAR score. A RegiSCAR score of 4 to 5 indicates probable DRESS, and a score greater than 5 indicates definite DRESS. Management requires immediate drug withdrawal, systemic corticosteroids, and dermatology consultation. Be aware that DRESS can have a prolonged, relapsing course and carries risks of long-term sequelae like autoimmune thyroiditis and type 1 diabetes. Thromboembolism is a common and dangerous non-infectious cause of fever. 14 to 26% of patients with a pulmonary embolism will develop a fever. This is typically a low-grade fever, though high fever can rarely occur. If the fever is higher, you must search for a concurrent infection. The fever is thought to be driven by pyrogenic cytokines, such as tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6, released from the infarcted pulmonary tissue. Always consider thromboembolism in postoperative patients, those who are immobilized, or patients with active malignancy. Central or neurogenic fever occurs when the brain itself drives the temperature elevation. This is a diagnosis of exclusion after a complete infectious workup. It is strongly associated with subarachnoid hemorrhage, where fever occurs in roughly 70% of patients, and about half of those fevers are non-infectious. It is also seen with intraventricular hemorrhage, traumatic brain injury, and brain tumors. Central fevers typically have an earlier onset, longer duration, and reach higher peak temperatures. A central fever onset within the first 72 hours of admission strongly predicts a non-infectious cause. Crucially, because the mechanism is not mediated by cyclooxygenase, standard antipyretics are ineffective, and treatment relies on external cooling. Transfusion reactions are critical causes of hospital-acquired fever. A febrile non-hemolytic transfusion reaction is defined as a 1 degree Celsius rise during or within 4 hours of transfusion. However, you must immediately rule out life-threatening reactions. Acute hemolytic reactions present with fever, flank pain, and hemoglobinuria. Transfusion-related acute lung injury presents with fever, acute hypoxemia, and bilateral infiltrates. Bacterial contamination, which is most common with platelet transfusions stored at room temperature, presents with high fever, rigors, and hypotension. For any suspected reaction, the immediate management steps are to stop the transfusion, send the blood unit and a fresh patient blood sample to the blood bank, and send a direct antiglobulin test. Several other conditions frequently cause non-infectious fever. Clostridioides difficile colitis is a common and often missed cause of fever, especially in the post-antibiotic setting. Acalculous cholecystitis can occur in critically ill or fasted patients. Acute pancreatitis causes a systemic inflammatory response syndrome-mediated fever. Mesenteric ischemia classically presents with pain out of proportion to the physical exam. Finally, crystal arthropathies like gout and pseudogout can mimic septic arthritis, making joint aspiration for crystal analysis essential. Fever can also result from tissue damage, such as from surgical trauma, fat embolism syndrome, ischemic bowel, or hematoma resorption. It is important to distinguish early postmyocardial infarction fever, which occurs in the first 24 to 48 hours due to myocardial necrosis, from true Dressler syndrome, which is an autoimmune pericarditis occurring weeks later. Autoimmune conditions such as systemic lupus erythematosus and adult-onset Still's disease can present with fever. Neoplastic fevers, particularly from lymphoma or renal cell carcinoma, are also important to consider. A classic clinical pearl is the naproxen test. Neoplastic fevers typically respond to naproxen within 24 hours, unlike infectious fevers, though this test is not perfectly specific. Endocrine emergencies are rare but life-threatening. Thyroid storm presents with high fever, severe tachycardia, and altered mental status. The Birch-Wartowski point scale is used for evaluation. A A score of 45 or greater is highly suggestive of thyroid storm. Treatment includes propylthiouracil, iodine, and beta blockers like propranolol. A critical teaching point: aspirin and salicylates are strictly contraindicated in thyroid storm because they displace thyroxine from binding proteins, worsening the thyrotoxicosis. Adrenal crisis can present with fever and shock. A random cortisol level of less than 3 micrograms per deciliter is strongly suggestive, though a concentropin stimulation test confirms the diagnosis. Treatment requires immediate stress dose hydrocortisone, typically 100 milligrams intravenously every 8 hours. Hyperthermic emergencies represent true dysregulation of the hypothalamic set point, with temperatures often exceeding 41 degrees Celsius. While infections can rarely cause temperatures this high, such as in severe central nervous system infections, you must immediately consider 3 key syndromes. Neuroleptic malignant syndrome is triggered by dopamine antagonists or rapid withdrawal of Parkinson's medications, presenting with lead pipe rigidity. Serotonin syndrome is triggered by serotonergic drugs and presents with clonus and hyperreflexia. Diagnosis is aided by the Hunter serotonin toxicity criteria. Malignant hyperthermia is triggered by volatile anesthetics and causes severe rigidity. Let us compare these 3 hyperthermic emergencies directly. Neuroleptic malignant syndrome develops over days, features lead pipe rigidity and bradycareflexia, and is treated with supportive care and lorazepam as the first-line agent. For severe or refractory cases, bromocriptine, amantadine, or dantrolene may be added. Serotonin syndrome develops rapidly over hours, features clonus and hyperreflexia, and is treated with supportive care and cyproheptadine. Malignant hyperthermia occurs during or shortly after anesthesia, features severe rigidity and rhabdomyolysis, and requires immediate treatment with intravenous dantrolene following your institution's malignant hyperthermia protocol. Procalcitonin is a biomarker helpful for guiding antibiotic stewardship. It is best validated for guiding antibiotic discontinuation, not for initiating antibiotics in critically ill patients. The threshold for discontinuation is typically an 80% decrease from the peak value. Standard cutoffs are 0.5 nanograms per milliliter in the intensive care unit and 0.25 nanograms per milliliter for respiratory protocols. Procalcitonin remains low in drug fevers and autoimmune flares, but beware of false positives in major surgery, trauma, or renal failure. It is also unreliable in immunocompromised patients or localized infections like abscesses. Let us summarize and return to our clinical vignette. The 68-year-old postoperative patient with a new fever, eosinophilia, and a maculopapular rash on day 8 most likely has a drug fever, possibly progressing to DRESS syndrome. The inappropriately well appearance and negative cultures point away from infection. The next step is to identify and stop the offending medication, likely his postoperative antibiotics, and monitor closely for resolution or signs of systemic involvement. Remember, a systematic approach to fever evaluation is essential, and anchoring on infection can lead to patient harm. Thank you for your attention.